Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Can you imagine how creepy it would be working at a water treatment plant after dark? Can you imagine getting lost in a big place outdoors like the Grand Canyon? Well, you're about to find out. Welcome back. I'm starving. Did you bring those Funyuns I asked for? No? Well, I'm a little butthurt now, but I guess I'll go ahead and tell you these stories. Join me in the lounge and let's get chatting. These are Tales from the Break Room. Warning: the following story contains depictions of violence against pets. Dog Catcher Confessions. From Neo. I've been a dog catcher for about 15 years. And let me tell you, this job isn't always as simple as chasing after lost puppies. I've seen some stuff that still gives me the creeps when I think about it. I've got 2 stories for you. Both happened within a few months of each other, about 5 years into my career. By then, I honestly thought I'd seen it all. But I was very wrong. The first incident happened on a crisp autumn evening in a ritzy neighborhood on the outskirts of town. You know the type: big houses and manicured lawns. The kind of place where a stray dog is more scandalous than a cheating spouse. We'd been getting calls for a few days about a sickly-looking dog roaming the area. The residents there were getting all worked up, worried it might be rabid or dangerous. So, being the dedicated public servant I am, I headed out there just as the sun was setting. I cruised the streets for a while, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of our 4-legged friend. Just as I was about to call it a night, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. A flash of mangy fur. I got a good look at it before it disappeared around a corner at the edge of a wooded area. Matted brown fur, all scruffy from fights, and covered in dirt. For a brief moment I thought it'd be pretty cute if someone got it all cleaned up and the help it needed, especially with that completely white left ear. "Gotcha," I muttered, pulling my van over and grabbing my catch pole. I followed the direction I'd seen the dog go, moving quietly so as to not spook it. The houses were thinning out here, with more trees and undergrowth between them. It was getting dark fast, and I was starting to regret not bringing a better flashlight. As I rounded the corner, my blood ran cold. There, not 20 feet in front of me, was the dog. I knew it was because it had the same white left ear, but something was terribly wrong. The dog was now lying on the ground, completely motionless, not breathing. And its head, good God, its head had been torn off. Not mauled, I mean, with no exaggeration, perfectly, cleanly separated from its body. Like someone had taken a laser to freaking slice it off. I had never seen anything like it in my life. I stood there, frozen in shock. My mind was desperately trying to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find an explanation for how this happened. I approached it and touched its side, hesitantly. For God's sake, the dog's body was still warm. Whatever had done this had been here literally fractions of a second before I arrived. But that's impossible. I had just seen the dog run around the corner, alive and whole. And in the time it took me to follow, what? Someone cut its head off with surgical precision, then vanished? This was a medium-sized dog, maybe 50 to 60 pounds. No one was going to take its head off that quickly and cleanly. I listened closely, straining my ears for any noise, because I suddenly began to feel very, very creeped out. But there was nothing, just the eerie, silent woods nearby and a very quiet neighborhood behind me. My heart was pounding. I'd like to say I bravely investigated further, but the truth is, I ran. I ran right back to my van so fast. I fumbled with my keys too, but I got the heck out of there. I called it in, of course, I had to. But I didn't stick around to answer questions, not even to clean up the body. I don't think I could look at that poor dog again. My more experienced and aged colleagues said it was a coyote or a big cat, but they weren't about to convince me that a big cat or coyote could do that to an animal. I don't think any animal can make a cut that clean, that quickly on a 50 to 60 pound dog. I still drive by that neighborhood sometimes when work takes me that way. And every time I can't help but slow down near that wooded corner, half expecting to see something. I don't really know what, but anything that might explain what happened that night. I want to ask anyone reading or hearing this, what do you think happened? Because I'm completely lost for an explanation. Then again, it could be related to my next tale. The next incident happened just a few months after the first. By then, I'd somewhat managed to convince myself that I'd at least exaggerated the memory of the headless dog incident. But this next one was not getting explained away very easily. We'd been having issues with this pack of dogs roaming around one of the older suburbs. They'd been attacking people's pets, digging up gardens, that sort of thing. Nothing too unusual, but of course the residents were worried. If they would attack pets, they might attack people's children. So I was pulling some late shifts, trying to track down these troublemakers and put an end to the problem. It was about 1 a.m., and I was cruising slowly through the neighborhood, windows down despite the chill in the air. I figured I'd have a better chance of hearing the dogs before I saw them. As I turned onto a quiet cul-de-sac, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. There in the shadows between two houses was a large dog-like shape. It was moving on all fours like a dog, but something seemed a bit off. It was much bigger than any dog I'd seen, for one thing, and its movements were strange, almost jerky, like a puppet being manipulated by an unskilled hand trying to replicate the movements of a dog. I killed the engine and the lights, not wanting to spook whatever it was. For a few minutes, I just sat there, watching. The creature, I hesitate to call it a dog even now, was sniffing around the base of a tall privacy fence, the kind people put up when they really don't want to see their neighbors. I was just about to get out of the van for a closer look when it happened. The thing stopped what it was doing and seemed to freeze for a moment. Then, in a quick movement, it darted around the corner of the fence, disappearing from view. I sat there, engine off, straining my eyes in the dark. Part of me wanted to start the van and just leave, but curiosity got the better of me. I mean, what was that thing? It wasn't a normal dog, that much I was sure of. As I sat there debating whether to get out and investigate, something caught my eye that made my blood run cold. There, peeking over the top of the privacy fence, a good 6 or 7 feet high, mind you, was a head. Not a human head, but not quite a dog's either. It was just wrong somehow in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on, and it was staring right at me. That thing I'd seen crawling around, that was its head. How in the world it managed to reach all the way up there to look at me, I had no idea. I couldn't make its features out in the darkness, but I could feel its gaze locked onto me. It was a very terrifying moment. I felt like a mouse that had just been spotted by a hawk, like prey that knew it was about to die. The thing had not climbed the fence, it hadn't jumped, and I know that there was nothing to stand on over there, which I realized after driving through the area the next day, to be sure. 1 second it was on all fours on one side, the next its head was popping up on the other, as casual as you please. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, for that creature's head to be visible over a fence like that. It would have to be standing on two legs. But that's not right. No dog was that tall on two legs. I don't remember starting the van. I don't remember driving the way. What I do remember was being parked outside a 24-hour diner on the other side of town, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold my cup of coffee. I called in sick the next day, the same day I went back to check out that fence, and I took another day off after that. When I came back, I made up some story about a stomach bug. I never reported what I saw. It didn't seem right to report something that weird. These days, whenever I'm driving around at night and I pass a privacy fence, I can't help but glance up, half expecting to see a pair of eyes peering over it at the top, looking right back at me. So far, it hasn't happened, but I always drive a little faster, just in case. I've got more creepy and weird stories from my dog-catching years. If you want to hear more, let me know. I'll try to find time to write them down. The Silent Watcher. From Grandiose Retiree. I used to be a middle school teacher. The scariest thing that ever happened to me happened at the Grand Canyon. And it wasn't something that happened to me directly, but to one of my students. It's a long and traumatic story, and to be forward and clear with you, I'm not sure I understand everything that happened. But here goes, and by the way, names will be changed for the sake of privacy. Over a decade ago, I organized a field trip to the Grand Canyon for my 7th grade class. It was supposed to be a fun, educational experience, a chance for the kids to learn about geology, ecology, and Native American history, while bonding as a group. We'd been planning it for months. Everyone was excited about it. There were about 30 students in attendance, myself and 3 other chaperones. Most of the kids were your typical energetic 12 to 13-year-olds, chattering away as we hiked the trails and took in the breathtaking views. But there was one student, Kyle, who stood out to me from the start. Kyle was always a quiet kid, a bit of a loner. He didn't have many friends, and he usually kept to himself during class. But he seemed genuinely excited about this trip, in his own reserved way. I noticed at one point him hanging back from the group a bit, but he was clearly taking everything in. His eyes were wide as he stared out at the canyon. The first day was great. We did some easier hikes, learning about rock layers, and we even got to try out some hands-on archaeology activities. That night, we set up camp in a designated area, and the kids had a blast, roasting marshmallows and telling some ghost stories around the campfire. It was on the second day that things started to get strange. We were about halfway through a morning hike when Kyle approached me. He looked uneasy. He was fidgeting with the straps of his backpack, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. "Mr. Johnson?" he said in a low voice. "I think someone's watching us." I'll admit, I didn't take him too seriously at first. Kids that age can have very active imaginations, and some of the more insecure ones can be very paranoid about strangers, especially in a place as awe-inspiring and slightly eerie as the Grand Canyon. "What do you mean, Kyle?" I asked, trying to sound concerned but not overly alarmed. He hesitated, then said, "There's a man in a dark jacket. He's been following us since we started the hike. I keep seeing him behind rocks or trees." I looked around, but I didn't see anyone matching that description. Just our group and a few other tourists in the distance. "Are you sure it's not just another hiker?" I suggested, gently. Kyle shook his head. "No, he's different. He's always watching us, and I don't think he has a face." Though the last part was odd, I'd be lying if I said it didn't send chills down my spine. But I reminded myself that Kyle was probably letting his imagination run wild. Maybe the ghost stories from before had gotten to him, Or maybe he was feeling a bit homesick or anxious about being away from home. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Kyle, I promise you, we're perfectly safe here. There are rangers all over the park, and we've got our whole group. But if it makes you feel better, I'll keep an eye out for you, okay?" He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. As we continued the hike, I noticed Kyle growing more and more agitated, looking even more frequently over his shoulder. A couple of times I caught him staring intently at seemingly empty spots along the trail. By lunchtime, Kyle's behavior was starting to worry me. He barely touched his food and jumped at every little sound. I pulled him aside after we ate. "Kyle, what's going on? You seem really upset." His eyes were wide and frightened. "He's still following us, Mr. Johnson. I saw him 3 times since last we talked. Why can't anyone else see him?" I looked around again, still seeing nothing out of the ordinary. "Kyle, I promise you there's no one following us. Maybe you're just tired from all the hiking. Do you need to rest for a bit?" He shook his head violently. "You don't believe me. No one ever believes me." The desperation in his voice made my heart ache. I knelt down to his level. "Kyle, I believe you're seeing something. I just don't think it's what you think it is. You see, sometimes our minds can play tricks on us, especially when we're in new places." Kyle's face crumpled, and for a moment I thought he was going to cry. But then he just turned away and trudged back to the group. For the rest of the afternoon, I kept a close eye on Kyle. He grew increasingly withdrawn, barely responding when his classmates tried to engage with him. I also made a point of scanning our surroundings regularly, but I never saw any sign of the man Kyle described. As we set up camp that evening, I pulled aside Mrs. Reeves, one of our chaperones, and filled her in on the situation. We agreed to keep a closer watch on Kyle and to make sure one of us was always nearby. After dinner, we let the kids have some free time before bed. Most of them sat around the campfire, laughing and chatting, but Kyle was nowhere to be seen. At first, I wasn't too worried. Kyle was the type who often needed some alone time, and I figured he might have just wandered off a little to decompress. But as the minutes ticked by, and there was still no sign of him, a knot of dread and guilt began to form in my stomach. I did a head count. Everyone was there, save for Kyle. I tried to stay calm as I announced to the group that Kyle was missing. Mrs. Reeves and I organized a search, keeping most of the kids at the campsite, while we and the other 2 chaperones, along with a few of the older students, began combing the immediate area. We called Kyle's name, checked behind every boulder and bush, but there was no trace. As darkness fell, my sense of panic grew. The Grand Canyon can be a very dangerous place, especially after dark. There are steep drops that can be difficult to see, wild animals, and it's very easy to get lost if you wander off the marked trails. After an hour of fruitless searching, I had to make the call I'd been dreading to make. I contacted the park rangers to report Kyle missing. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Rangers arrived with search dogs and better equipment. They questioned all of us about when we'd last seen Kyle and what he had been wearing. I also told them about his strange behavior earlier in the day, telling them about what he said, about the man he claimed to see. They took down all the information, but I could tell they were more focused on the possibility that Kyle had simply wandered off and gotten lost somewhere. As the search stretched into the night, I stayed at our campsite with most of the students. They were scared and confused, and I did my best to reassure them while my own mind raced with horrible possibilities. It was well past midnight when one of the rangers radioed in. They'd found Kyle. The relief I felt was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. The ranger's voice was tense as he gave us the bare details. Kyle had been found unconscious at an abandoned campsite several miles from where we were staying. He was alive, but unresponsive. They were airlifting him to a hospital in Flagstaff. I wanted to go with Kyle, but I couldn't leave the rest of the students. As the rangers rushed off to meet the helicopter, one of them pulled me aside and told me something that made my blood run cold. "There's something else," he said in a low voice. "When we found the boy, there were strange marks on his neck. Symbols of some kind. Not sure what they mean. I wanted to ask if he had done that himself before he left." No, sir, he didn't. There were no markings on his neck the last time I saw him." I felt as if the ground had dropped out from under me. All I could think about was Kyle insisting that someone had been following us, watching us. Was he right the entire time? The rest of the night passed by in a haze of worry and confusion. I had to contact Kyle's parents, deal with the other students' questions and fears, try to make sense of what had happened. But my mind kept circling back to those symbols the ranger had mentioned. What were they? Who had put them there? What did they look like? The next morning, we had to make the difficult decision to cut the trip short. The other students were too shaken up to continue, and frankly, so was I. As we packed up camp and prepared to leave, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. I kept thinking about what Kyle had said, about this man who didn't have a face. Was that last part just his imagination? Or was that truthful too? Had he seen something the rest of us missed? As we made our way back to Phoenix, I was torn between wanting to rush to the hospital to check on Kyle and needing to ensure the rest of the students got home safely. In the end, my responsibility to the group won out, but I did make a call to the hospital as soon as we arrived back in the city. The news wasn't good. Kyle was physically stable, but he still had not regained consciousness. The doctors, however, could not find any medical reason for his condition. There was no head trauma, no signs of dehydration or exposure. It was as if he had simply shut down. I spent the next few days dealing with the aftermath of that trip. There were worried parents to placate, school administrators to brief, and a mountain of paperwork to fill out. But my thoughts were constantly with Kyle. I visited him in the hospital whenever I could, sitting by his bedside and talking to him, hoping that he could hear me. It was during one of these visits, about a week after the incident, that Kyle finally woke up. I was reading a book aloud to him when I noticed his eyelids fluttering. My heart leapt as his eyes slowly opened, but the relief I felt quickly turned to concern. Kyle's eyes were different. That spark of curiosity that had always been there before, even behind his quiet demeanor, was gone. In its place was a dull, empty look that sent a chill through me. "Kyle," I said softly, "can you hear me?" He turned his head slightly towards me, but his gaze seemed to look right through me. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You didn't believe me." Those words tied my innards in a knot. "Kyle, I'm sorry," I tried to apologize, but Kyle would not say anything after that. He turned away from me and stared blankly at the wall. The doctors ran more tests, still unable to find anything physically wrong with Kyle. Physically, he was fine, but mentally, it was like he had retreated into himself, barely responding to anyone or anything. I tried to get Kyle to talk about what happened in the canyon, but he would either ignore me completely or become agitated, sometimes even violent. As the days turned into weeks, Kyle showed no signs of improvement. His parents were devastated, and I was consumed by guilt. I just felt that I had failed Kyle. That if I had just believed him when he first came to me, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe it was the guilt, maybe it was the curiosity, but I found myself nearly obsessed with trying to figure out what had happened to Kyle in the canyon. I pored over maps of the area where he'd been found, researched local legends and folklore, even reached out to some of the Native American tribes in the region to see if they knew anything about the symbols that had reportedly been found on Kyle's neck. But everywhere I turned, I hit dead ends. The park rangers told me they had no record of any similar incidents. The local tribes were either unwilling to talk about it, or genuinely had no idea what I was talking about. And the symbols themselves? No one would tell me what they meant, where they came from, or what they looked like. As the weeks stretched into months, Kyle's condition didn't improve. If anything, he seemed to be retreating further into himself. His parents, at a loss for what to do, eventually decided to take him home and care for him there. Kyle stopped coming to school altogether. I would check in with his parents from time to time, but the news was always the same. Kyle would rarely leave his room, barely ate, and almost never spoke. The incident in the canyon had effectively ended Kyle's childhood. The bright, curious boy I knew was gone, replaced by a shell of a person who seemed to be constantly scared of something the rest of us couldn't see, and also racked with anger that we didn't believe him. I tried to move on with my life, to focus on my other students and my teaching, but the guilt just ate and ate away at me. On a few occasions, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my stomach all knotted up again with anxiety and guilt. During class, I would sometimes catch myself staring out the window, half expecting to see a man in a dark jacket watching from across the street. Life went on, the years passed, and eventually I retired from teaching. I never did forget about Kyle. From time to time, I would still check in with his parents, hoping against hope that there had been some improvement. But there never was. About a month ago, I received the news I'd been dreading for years. Kyle had killed himself. The details were sparse, but apparently he had become increasingly agitated in the days leading up to his death. His parents said he kept insisting that he was watching, and that no one believes him. They had no idea what Kyle was talking about. The night before it happened, Kyle had locked himself in his room. His parents could hear him moving furniture around, like he was barricading the door. In the morning, when they finally managed to get into his room, they found him hanging. I attended Kyle's funeral. My heart was heavy with grief and guilt. As I stood there listening to the pastor speak about Kyle's tragically short life, I kept telling myself it was my fault. I simply only had to believe him that day in the canyon. I could have helped him. I could have taken those kids home early, at the first sign of danger. But I hadn't. After the service, Kyle's mother approached me. She looked worn and tired, aged beyond her years by the ordeal she had been through. She placed a hand on my shoulder, and through tears, she told me, "It's not your fault. Don't blame yourself." I know I'll likely never stop blaming myself, but those words have helped me go on. But I'll never stop wondering, what took Kyle, and what did it do to him? I was corrected by a ghost. From Owlfoot. This story took place in 2001. I was 19, working at a small family-owned hotel in the rural parts of northern Sweden. Yes, I'm a Swede, when this all happened. I did a bit of everything, but I was mostly cleaning guest rooms and common areas. The couple who owned the place, I'll call them B and K, cared a lot about me, and I almost felt like I was part of the family. At the time of this encounter, the hotel was mostly empty, and I was on my break from cleaning rooms for the guests, who were going to arrive in a few days. So me, B, K, their son A, and his wife M, who came to visit, and a couple of their friends, F and D, were relaxing, just chatting in the common room. I can't remember exactly why the topic came up, but B told me that the hotel was haunted. There was at least one ghost lingering on the property, allegedly, and they believed it was an old landlady, and she sometimes made herself known to both the family and guests. F, the friend of B and K, claimed that she was clairvoyant and that she could confirm that yes, the place really was haunted. She felt the presence of something supernatural as soon as she came to visit, and they came to stay at the hotel at least once a year. This presence, a woman, was mostly seen on the third floor in rooms number 15, 16, and 17, but not exclusively. A and M claimed they had seen her down in the basement. At this point, I'd gone ashen because I was and still am really scared of ghosts. In general, I'm really easy to scare. I can't watch a single horror film. I wouldn't watch one even if I got paid to do it. And just the thought of seeing something supernatural filled me with dread. I would probably jump right out of my skin if I saw something like that. It didn't matter that everyone in the room, when seeing my face, promised me that the woman was friendly. B said the woman was even helpful at times, that when B was cleaning rooms for guests, sometimes the ghost would correct her if she made a mistake. For example, B said that she could clean a room, then close the door, but when she came back just minutes later, the door would stand open. Not just a little crack, but wide open. If she then looked inside the room, she said that there would always be something she had forgotten to do or left in there by mistake, like a chair still standing on top of a desk because she had been vacuuming the floor and forgot to put it back down again, or a rag left hanging on the sink. So, B said, she is strict but kind. She wants guests to have the best experience. So when we do something wrong, she just wants to help by pointing it out so we can get it fixed. Earlier, I said that B and K pretty much treated me like family. This is important because I know they wouldn't have lied to me or tried to scare me on purpose, nor would A, M, F, or D. When I most likely looked terrified, they did their very best to calm my nerves, assuring me that there was nothing to be scared of. My break was over, and to my horror, I realized my next set of rooms to clean were on the third floor. The third and second floor were empty of guests, so I was all alone up there. B and K were down in the lobby. A and M had left and F and D were outside enjoying the summer day. So, all alone. On the third floor, there was also a small bathroom with a toilet, a sink, and a shower. And I decided to clean that first, trying to work up some courage before moving on to the dreaded numbers 15, 16, and 17. Thankfully, I didn't feel or see anything weird in those rooms, but I was still on edge, meaning that I picked up on every sound on that floor, but I couldn't hear anything, nothing, and the house was old, so if anyone was walking around outside in the corridor, I would have heard it. When I was done with the last room, I realized I'd forgotten to bring towels for the guests, so I went out into the corridor to get some from a storage room. Then I froze. The door to the bathroom stood wide open. I swear I was so scared, I couldn't even move at first. But after a while, I remembered what B had told me, that open doors most likely meant that something wasn't right with your cleanup. I was the staff doing the cleaning, so it was my responsibility to look. I told myself that over and over as I walked very slowly over to the bathroom, turning on the lights and looking inside. Could it have just been a guest using the toilet or taking a shower? No, because everything was exactly as I had left it. No mist, no water on the floor from the shower, no drops of water in the sink. The toilet paper roll was untouched. There were mirrors in all rooms, so for someone to have gone up here just to look in a mirror seemed unlikely. So I slowly looked around, and there was a bottle of shampoo standing on a small shelf in the shower stall. The hotel does not provide the guests with anything other than soap, so it was clearly someone's private bottle. I had been in there not too long ago, cleaned it to the point of folding the end bit of the toilet paper roll into a V shape to look fancy, but somehow I'd missed a whole bottle of shampoo. I carefully picked up the bottle, and I said out loud, "Thank you," and I turned off the lights, closing the door and walking away to get some towels, because I did not want to get corrected again. That would be embarrassing. Did I calm down after that? No, absolutely not. I was still freaked out. But I survived. I do believe that the old landlady was there on the third floor with me that day, reminding me to look one more time at my work so that the guests would feel welcomed to clean rooms and clean bathrooms. So thank you, lady. I learned my lesson. I hate the night shift. From 90s radio. I've worked a lot of jobs in my life, but none of them left me as shaken as my time managing the night shift at McDonald's. Most people think the scariest thing about working at a fast food joint is dealing with angry customers, food rushes, or even the occasional kitchen accident. But let me tell you, there are things that happen in the dead of night that'll make you question everything you thought you knew. This happened about 7 years ago. I was managing the night shift at a 24-hour McDonald's just off the highway in a town in Ohio. It was a pretty quiet location most of the time, especially after midnight. We would get the occasional trucker or insomniac college student, but for the most part, it was just me and my small crew, keeping the place running until the morning shift arrived. The night it all started was a Tuesday in late October. It was unreasonably cold, and a light drizzle had been falling all evening, making everything look hazy under the yellow glow of the parking lot lights. Around 2 a.m., I was in the back office doing some paperwork when I heard one of our cashiers call out. I'll refer to her as Samantha. "Hey, Mark, you might want to come out here." There was something in her voice that made me nervous. Samantha was usually pretty composed, calm, collected, but she sounded on edge. I headed out to the front, and that's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing just inside the door, dripping water onto the recently mopped floor. He was tall, maybe 6'4", but rail thin. His clothes were ragged and mismatched, a tattered overcoat that was way too small for him, dirty jeans, and what looked like hospital slippers on his feet. But it was his face that really got to me. His eyes were really wide, bloodshot, and seemed to be looking in slightly different directions. His mouth was stretched in a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach those unsettling eyes. "Can we help you, sir?" Samantha said, her voice oddly steady despite the tension I could see in her shoulders. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly, that weird grin still plastered on his face. Water dripped steadily from his clothes, forming a puddle around his feet. I stepped forward. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need any help?" Slowly, as if his neck were rusty, he turned his head to look at me. His grin somehow widened even farther. "I'm here for the special," he said, his voice a raspy whisper that somehow carried across the empty restaurant. I glanced at Samantha, confused. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't have any special promotions running right now. Can I interest you in something from our regular menu?" The man's expression didn't change, but he took a shambling step forward. No, he said, shaking his head jerkily. The special. The one that's not on the menu, the one they told me about. A chill ran down my spine. I'd dealt with my fair share of difficult customers and people under the influence, but something about this guy was different. There was an intensity to him, a barely contained energy that made me want to put as much distance between us as possible. I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what you're talking about, I said, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. If you'd like to order something, we'd be happy to help you. Otherwise, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. For a long moment, he just stared at me, that grin still fixed in place. Then, without warning, he slammed his hands down on the counter, making Samantha jump back with a startled yelp. You know, he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty restaurant. You all know it's here. It's always been here. I stepped in front of Samantha, my heart pounding. Sir, I need you to calm down and leave the premises now, or I'll be forced to call the police. He leaned in close and I could smell the sour stench of unwashed body and something else, something chemical and unpleasant. You can't stop it, he whispered, his bloodshot eyes piercing mine. It's coming, it's always been coming, and when it gets here, oh, when it gets here. He trailed off, giggling to himself. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and shambled out the door, disappearing into the misty night. I locked the door behind him, my hand shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. Samantha was now pale and visibly shaken. What the heck was that about? She asked. I shook my head. I don't know. Probably just some guy off his meds. I'll keep an eye on the cameras in case he comes back. But he didn't come back, not that night anyway. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to think that maybe it had just been a one-off incident. But then, exactly a week later, he showed up again. It was around the same time, just after 2 a.m. This time, I was at the front, restocking the napkins and straws. I heard the door open and turned to greet the customer automatically, only to feel my blood run cold as I saw that same tall, gaunt figure shambling in. He looked, if possible, even worse than before. His clothes were even filthier, hanging off his skeletal frame. His hair was matted and wild, and there were dark stains on his coat that I didn't want to think too much about. But his face, well, that was the same. That too wide grin, those mismatched bloodshot eyes. Welcome back, I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. Have you decided you'd like to order this time? He cocked his head to the side, almost bird-like. It's closer now, he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Can't you feel it? It's almost here. I swallowed hard. Sir, I'm gonna need you to leave. We can't help you here with whatever this is. He shuffled forward, his grin never wavering. Oh, but you can, you will. When it comes, you'll all help. You won't have a choice. I reached for the phone, ready to call the police, but he held up a hand. No need for that, he said, suddenly sounding almost lucid. I'm going, but I'll be back. When it's time, I'll be back. And just like that, he turned and left, disappearing once again into the night. This pattern continued for weeks. Every Tuesday night, like clockwork, he would show up. Sometimes he would just stand there, grinning and swaying. Other times he'd rant about the special or how it was getting closer, and each time he looked worse. Thinner, dirtier, more unhinged, if that was even possible. I tried everything I could think of. I did call the police, but by the time they arrived, he was always long gone. I reached out to local homeless shelters and mental health facilities, but no one recognized my description of him. I considered quitting by that point, but something kept me there. I guess it was a sense of responsibility to my staff, not to mention the job market wasn't the best at the moment. It all came to a head on a bitterly cold night in December. It was snowing heavily, and I remember thinking that surely he would not show up in this kind of weather. But at 2 a.m., right on schedule, the door opened. He looked different. His clothes were the same ragged mess, but his face had changed. The manic grin was gone, replaced by an expression of eerie calm. His eyes, for once, were focused and clear. "It's here," he said softly as he approached the counter. I felt a surge of frustration and fear. "What's here? What the heck have you been talking about all this time? Why do you keep harassing my staff?" He reached into his coat, and for one terrifying moment, I thought he was about to pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a crumpled, stained piece of paper. "The special," he said, smoothing out the paper on the counter. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was an old McDonald's flyer, so faded and water-damaged that I could barely make out the text, but written on it with what appeared to be black marker or Sharpie was 2:05 a.m. I looked up at him confused. "I don't get it. What is this?" His calm expression cracked, that familiar manic grin spreading across his face once more. He looked over at the nearby clock in such a way I could tell that he wanted me to look too. I looked over. 2:04, only a few seconds away from 2:05. Before I could say anything else, I looked back at the man, and he began to convulse right there on the spot and collapse on the floor. He kept saying, "It's here. It's here." Staring at the clock, I called 911, and I don't know why, but when I glanced at the clock again, it read 2:05. I'll remember that for the rest of my life. By the time the paramedics showed up, the man was dead. The official report said he died of hypothermia and malnutrition, exacerbated by some kind of psychotic episode. My first thought was that some crazed man had taken some drugs to make sure he died at 2:05, just like he'd written down on that flyer. But after hearing the report, how they found no trace of anything unusual in his system, I was dumbfounded and freaked out. Had this man known the exact minute he would die and decided to make us join him to watch? I quit my job at McDonald's the next day. I couldn't bear to be in that restaurant anymore, couldn't shake the memory of that man's wild eyes, cryptic warnings, and disturbing final moments. I don't even eat at McDonald's anymore. Just reminds me of what happened that night, makes me feel gross and sick. It was the creepiest and weirdest experience I've ever had. Echoes at the Water Treatment Facility. From Bob Rager. I work as a water treatment facility operator. Usually I work overnight, and most nights are quiet. Just me, the hum of some machinery, and the occasional visit from a raccoon trying to get into the dumpsters out back. There was a night a few years ago that I still can't explain. It's the reason I always bring a buddy when I need to check the filtration chambers now, even if it means waking up the day shift operator. It was a Tuesday in late October. The weather had turned cold early that year, and a light drizzle had been falling all day, making everything damp and miserable. I came in for my shift at 11 p.m., as usual, did the handover with the evening operator, and settled in for another quiet night of monitoring systems and doing routine checks. Around 2 a.m., I was in the control room, watching the monitors and making notes in the logbook, when I noticed something odd. The turbidity levels in filtration chamber 3 were fluctuating. For those who don't know, turbidity is basically how clear the water is. We measure it constantly because it can indicate all sorts of problems, anything from equipment malfunction to contamination in the water supply. Now, small fluctuations are normal. Water isn't always consistent, especially when it's raining. But these spikes were bigger than usual, and they were happening in a weird pattern. It would spike for a few seconds, then drop back down to normal, then spike again a minute or two later. I watched it for about 15 minutes, trying to figure out what could be causing it. Could be a faulty sensor, I thought. Or maybe some debris had gotten into the chamber somehow. Either way, I knew I had to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and radio. Then I headed out to the filtration building. It's a big, echoey place, full of massive concrete tanks and a maze of pipes. The sound of running water is constant, but you get used to it after a while. Filtration chamber 3 is at the far end of the building. As I walked towards it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp October air. Something felt off. The shadows seemed deeper than usual, the echoes a little too loud. I reached the chamber and climbed up to the observation walkway. Everything looked normal at first glance. The water was flowing through the sand and gravel beds like it was supposed to. The backwash system was operating on schedule. But then I saw something that made me freeze. There in the corner of the chamber was a dark shape. It was just below the surface of the water. It was hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked almost like a person, floating face down. My heart skipped a beat. Had someone fallen in? But how? The chamber is sealed when it's operating, and I had not had any alerts about a breach. I leaned in closer, trying to get a better look. That's when I heard it, a sound like a whisper. I could barely hear it over the noise of the flowing water. I couldn't make out words, but it did sound sad or lost. I swept my flashlight beam across the water, searching for the source of the sound, trying to get a better look at the shape I'd seen. But there was nothing there now. The water was now clear and undisturbed, except for its usual flow. I stood there for a moment, pointing my flashlight around the water's surface. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was I really that tired? I wondered. Just as I was about to head back to the control room, convinced I was seeing things, it happened again. The dark shape, just for a second, and with it came that whisper. But this time, I swear I made out words, like help and cold. I scrambled backwards, nearly falling off the walkway in my haste to get away. This can't be real, I thought. There was no way anyone could be in that water. The filtration process would have, well, I didn't want to think about what it would do to a human body. I ran back to the control room, my heart pounding. I checked and rechecked the sensors, looking for any sign of a malfunction or breach. Nothing. According to every instrument we had, filtration chamber 3 was operating perfectly normally. I spent the rest of my shift in that control room, watching the monitors like a hawk. The turbidity levels stabilized after about an hour, and there were no more unexplained readings for the rest of the night. When the morning shift arrived, I didn't tell them what had happened. I didn't really know what to say, that I had seen a ghost in the filtration chamber, that I'd heard voices. I'd probably sound crazy to a bunch of folks that I really wasn't familiar with. Had they been friends, I probably would have told them, but I didn't want basically strangers thinking I was drunk on the job, a very important job at that. However, I did do some research, and I'm not sure if this info helped me feel better, or if it's even connected at all. Turns out about 50 years back, before the treatment plant was built, there used to be a small lake where Filtration Chamber 3 now stands. In the winter of 1973, 2 teenagers fell through the ice while skating. Their bodies were not found until spring. Now, I'm not saying I believe in ghosts. I'm a practical guy. Always have been. But ever since these events, I swear on occasion I can hear whispering coming from that chamber. Sometimes even a splash. But these days I ignore it because I know it's nothing serious. When I do have to go check the filtration chambers though, I bring someone with me. Luckily for me, there's usually someone on staff with me in a different part of the building or doing rounds. But I won't hesitate to wake someone from the day shift, so long as I don't have to be alone there. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room, the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eeriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eeriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eeriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eeriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, at Dark Prevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.